Heads, 63. Heads, 64. 64 heads in a row. What do you make of that? Hey, it's Nicholas here to talk about mainstream science's rejection of spiritual, paranormal, and other non-conventional data. And by the end of this talk, I'll have shared a psychospiritual model of this rejection and reviewed the portfolio of things that can be done about it, including, of course, the do nothing at all option. So here's a massive oversimplification of the issue. If I toss a coin 64 times and come up with 64 heads, what should I conclude? According to conventional probability theory, that's a massively improbable event. It occurs less than 1 in 10 to the 19 times. Let's try to give that some sort of perspective. 10 to the 17 is roughly the number of seconds in the life of our universe so far. So if we had a machine that could do 64 coin tosses in a second, we'd expect to see 64 heads in a second about once if we ran that machine for a period about 100 times as long as the universe so far. So actually about 500 times because of rounding, but I think you get the picture. Nevertheless, one view of 64 heads is that it's a rare event that happens rarely with a fair heads tails coin. Another view is to see 64 heads as an event that happens all the time, because in fact, I was tossing a double heads coin. So the pivotal issue here is what I'll call low probability data. In this opening exploration, the observation of 64 heads in a row. And in this illustration, we could say the status quo paradigm is a fair heads tails coin. And what I'll call the new paradigm is a double-headed coin. So in the status quo, 64 heads is rare, but in the new paradigm, it's commonplace. In fact, it would be close to a reality violation if we didn't see 64 heads in this paradigm. So I first got interested in this topic of inferences from low P data when I was working in the financial markets in the 1990s. There are a number of traders with exceptional track records, and I wanted to find out whether low P exceptional performance was skill or chance. Later on, I read Margins of Reality by Yarn and Dunn. Then I found out about Radin and Nelson and random event generator work in general. Recently, I saw John Hagelin talk about a less than 1 in 10 to the 19 probability attributed to a meta-study of TM interventions designed to create or improve peace. And I'm aware that a number of people advocate a scientific study of low P near-death experiences, or NDEs, as a way to open the collective scientific mind to deeper realities. So the issue, again, now stated in a more general scientific-oriented way, is that we have low P data in all of those arenas I just mentioned and more. Are we to simply interpret them as things that happen, albeit rarely, in a reality described by a pre-existing scientific paradigm, or should we take them as evidence for a new paradigm in which observed events are more or less commonplace? Now, in the case of mainstream institutional science, there's a phenomenon which will be central to this talk, which I'm going to call closed-mindedness. So I use this term without judgment, at least I try to, because there are cases when it's entirely functional and rational to be closed-minded. For example, if I'm facing an extremely serious time-constrained situation, it can make perfect sense to spend a very limited amount of time and resources on triaging various different discrete response strategies, and then committing in a closed-minded way to the one that I've chosen. So that being said, what is the phenomenon that I'm calling closed-mindedness here? It can be viewed, as I think Brian Josephson construes it, as the assignment of a prior probability of 0 to the new paradigm. And so in part B of this talk, I'm going to explore in a bit more depth than usual where this assignment comes from, why it happens, and what can be done about it. But for now, let's just accept that it does. So obviously, if there's a prior assertion that the probability of the new paradigm is 0, it disappears from the inferential framework. And the only conclusion that we can make is that these low P data imply and solely represent a rare occurrence in the status quo paradigm. Now, the important thing about this kind of closed-mindedness is that it makes a status quo what I call p-proof. It doesn't matter how small the probability of data becomes in the existing paradigm, even if it gets continually smaller and smaller and smaller as new data accumulates. That's irrelevant if the new paradigm we're interested in is rigidly assigned a zero probability. So this point has led Dean Radin and others to assert that there's no point in trying to convince skeptics who are closed-minded in a prior probability equals zero kind of way. And one of the main points I want to make today is that this injunction is true for what we could call low P persuasion strategies. So an example of low P persuasion are those meta-observations I mentioned just now, pointed to by John Hagelin, which occur at less than 1 in 10 to the 19 probability in the status quo, suggesting that a new paradigm is a better explanation. But Radin's injunction doesn't apply, at least not on rational grounds, to a different class of strategies, what I call in-paradigm refutations and near-paradigm evolutions. So these work in a different way than low P persuasion, so they're immune to these zero prior probability defenses. But it's also important to recognize, and I'll probably mention it ad nauseum in this talk, that refutation and evolution isn't presented to skeptics as a way to convince them of a new paradigm. Instead, it's framed as a way for the status quo to pursue and achieve its own goals. So perhaps counterintuitively, this help towards goals path begins with the demonstration of the impossibility of goal completion in the current paradigm. But this refutation is then followed by a goal-oriented sequence of theoretical contexts and arbitration experiments, as we'll see, which takes the status quo towards its own goals. But the bottom line is, simply and crucially, there's more to be done to open minds than low P confrontations. One important more is the path of complementary logic and data that I just sketched, what I call the refutation and evolution path. And this I'll describe more in part A of the main talk. Then there's also what I call the suprarational path, the two main rational modes being low P persuasion and refutation and evolution. And I'll talk more about suprarationality in part B. But before I get onto all that, I'm going to sketch out this refutation and evolution path, in fact, in two different ways, because I'm currently having this curious experience where no matter how I put it, nobody really seems to get it. Okay, so let's start at this point, where we only have one frame or paradigm for the evaluation of data, because the zero prior probability has erased the primary alternative. Now, the next thing we do here is establish that this frame can't in fact complete its own goals, which for mainstream science are the rigorous data validated explanation of all natural phenomena. And crucially, this can't proof doesn't make any out of paradigm appeals, because these would of course trigger the prior probability equals zero defense against any transformational movement. So a bit more precisely and specifically, there's actually a theorem which shows that status quo science logically can't complete its own explanatory goals in its current form, and a complementary lemma or mini theorem which identifies the shift required so that those goals can be completed. So these kinds of theoretical logical proofs are what's meant by refutation in Refute and Evolve. So then we move on to an experiment, again, of a status quo congruent form, which can arbitrate between these two frames or paradigms and establish which actually occurs in our inhabited universe. So once this experiment decides in favor of this intermediate evolution of the status quo, the first evolutionary phase will be complete. Okay, then we do another round of refutation and evolution. So the first refutation highlights some theoretical problems that even the intermediate scenario hasn't addressed yet. And again, of course, these are problems of a status quo congruent kind, which leads to more experiments, status quo congruent all the way along to arbitrate between intermediate and intermediate 2 in terms of accurate description of our actual reality. And then that will support the intermediate 2 paradigm, which establishes really a third new status quo from the first one, intermediate 2. But what does all this get in terms of our original problem, which was the suppression of a new paradigm by a prior probability of 0 assertion? So we started here with what I called the closed-minded scenario. But when we really let go of the whole new paradigm issue and focused instead on serving the status quo's own goals, we ended up here in intermediate 2, all the way along by status quo congruent methods. Now, in relation to our original new paradigm problem, it just so happens that the structural form of the intermediate 2 frame is a near neighbor to the sorts of things we would need for the kind of new scientific paradigm we were originally interested in. At least it's far nearer than the status quo we started out from. So now the only rational assertion here is to assign a prior probability far greater than 0 to the new paradigm relative to intermediate 2. Now, some people might say that the original prior probability assertion of 0 wasn't rational at all. So appealing to rationality here doesn't really get you very far. I have a lot of sympathy with that kind of observation. And I'll talk more about it and how to respond to it in part B, which is focused on, again, a supra-rational inquiry into the origins of the apparent P equals 0 irrationality. But before I move into that direction, I just want to go over this refute and evolve strategy again in the second and perhaps more accessible way. So instead of construing the issue of closed-mindedness to a new paradigm in a probabilistic way, here I construe it as a problem of cognitive distance. So these topics like regs, NDEs, PK, and psi, and the varieties of consciousness I call MC, NC, and CC for matter-active, non-local, and cosmic consciousness. These are all just too far away from the status quo mindset to be cognitively acceptable. So I call the attempt to engender paradigm change by appealing to these things in this configuration as a far from paradigm intervention. So in refute and evolve, we pivot instead to a more acceptable far from status quo arena, namely the completion of the status quo's own goals. And then we work at the edge of the existing paradigm to move in that direction. So this gives us the successor paradigm, what I previously called intermediate 1. And then we work at the edge of intermediate 1 to move us to intermediate 2, which becomes a new status quo, which we've arrived at only by status quo moves at the edge of whatever was the then existing paradigm, the then status quo. And yet, when we put the focus back on our original new paradigm related data, we find that these are no longer at an extreme cognitive distance. In fact, the new status quo and what we previously conceived of as a distant new paradigm, these two now share a common edge or frontier. So part A, we'll look at some of the technical content of the refute and evolve strategy, albeit at a summary non-technical level. This is a strategy that induces movement in the status quo on the status quo's own terms. So specifically, we'll look at the central theorem, which initially suspends the status quo's movement by refuting the possibility of goal completion. Then at what I call the one experiment, which restores movement into intermediate 1, followed by a quick tour of some further theory and experiments, which induce movement into intermediate 2 from intermediate 1. And as we look at all of that, I'll be explaining the new paradigm relevant features of intermediate 1 and intermediate 2. So then part B will focus on a deeper understanding of the closed-minded stance, how it relates to deeper reality aspects, and then how to marry rational strategies like low P persuasion and refute and evolve with what I call supra-rational interventions. Then in part C, very briefly, I'll discuss what I call the delicacy of 3 or more factor interventions. The 3 here being, first, appeals to far from current paradigm, low P data like PK, psi, and NDEs. Second, the refute and evolve strategy from part A. And third, the suprarational intervention discussed in part B. So without further ado, let's move on to part A.